you here on the call, although I do see some new names. So my name's Michaela Rinquist. I was up until recently on the board of the NYC Fair Trade Coalition. Unfortunately, I had to step down because I had too many other things on my plate, and I wasn't able to give it as much energy as I wanted to. But in my daytime, I work for the UN Global Compact, which is the UN's corporate sustainability initiative. So we work on a lot of the same issues that the Fair Trade Coalition does, but more at the kind of, I don't know, corporate level versus smaller, medium-sized enterprise level. And I also am a huge history nerd. Love reading about politics, both the history of politics and also current day politics. Sometimes it drives me crazy though. So yeah, I was very excited when Lee invited me to present on the evolution of the revolution. So if you guys are ready, I'm happy to share my screen and get started. Okay, so this is the third iteration of a presentation that we've been calling the evolution of the revolution. So the first presentation was about the history of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Then I adapted that in, I want to say, April of this year to talk about, how previous labor movements and the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, kind of how that tied into past pandemics that the globe has experienced and how that has changed labor movements. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the evolution of the revolution and the way that the women's suffrage movement and the labor movements coincided throughout the last 2 centuries. So first question I always like to start with a bit of a fun fact, and feel free to unmute yourselves if you're able to do so. I'm curious if anyone has any guesses on who the first women and African Americans were that were legally allowed to vote in the United States. Does anyone have any guesses or happen to know off the top of their head who they might have been? Well, I will tell you, because this was an interesting thing that I discovered as I was doing my research. So the first women and African Americans who were legally allowed to vote were residents of New Jersey who lived there between 1776 and 1807. I know we have a few people from New Jersey here, so kudos to your state. And basically, after the American Revolution, there were women and a few African Americans who voted in New Jersey because the state's original constitution assigned voting rights to all free property owning residents, regardless of gender or race. And that was what the law that was in place until 1807, when, for whatever strange reason, the state passed a law limiting the franchise just to white men. So yeah, here we have a rare occasion of women and people of color having the opportunity to vote directly after the American Revolution. But we all know that it would take at least another century before those rights were truly available to everyone in this country. So how did the women's suffrage movement actually begin? So when people talk about the women's suffrage movement in the US, they often like to begin with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was the first women's rights convention that took place in the United States. And the two main organizers were a Quaker woman named Lucretia Mott and a non-Quaker woman who is a more well-known women's rights activist named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is portrayed here on the left at the convention. And it was a 2-day convention with a few hundred women and men, after which they signed what was called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this basically outlined the rights women should be entitled to as US citizens, including the right to vote. And you can see a list of some of the signers here on the right. And I just wanted to include this because this was another fun thing that I found when I was researching. So this is from a newspaper called The Recorder, and it's from an article dated August 3rd, 1848. And they decided to publish some excerpts from the Declaration of Sentiments. And I highlighted here this line in pink because I thought it was so obnoxious and hilarious at the same time, where they basically say, "We need not say that we think the movement excessively silly. Nevertheless, many of our readers will have a curiosity to run through the formidable document." So they were basically mocking these women for coming together and coming up with this document saying, we deserve to have these rights, you should give us these rights, and included in those rights should be the right to vote. And one thing that is important to note is that most early suffragists were also ardent abolitionists. And some people like to say that they were, in a sense, trained in the school of anti slavery and took lessons from the anti slavery movement to wage their campaign for women's rights. And while it is fair to say that a lot of suffragists were abolitionists, that doesn't necessarily mean that most abolitionists were also suffragists. But some of the notable figures spanning both movements that you might be familiar with are Frederick Douglass. Here on the left, he was a former slave, was an ardent abolitionist, also a suffragist. Sojourner Truth, who was also a former slave, turned abolitionist, suffragist, and then Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had started out as an abolitionist before focusing on women's rights. And these three historical figures actually worked together. They were contemporaries, they knew each other personally. And it was actually Frederick Douglass who had moved the needle on including women's voting rights in the Seneca Falls Declaration, because strangely enough, a lot of the women and men who were in attendance at the convention were not convinced that they should include women's suffrage as part of their platform. But he is known to have given a very eloquent and impassioned speech that convinced enough people to add it to the list. And it should also be noticed that he noted that he was the only African American person in attendance at the convention. And I would also like to mention that these three also had their disagreements. Elizabeth Cady Stanton gets a lot of praise for leading the women's movement in the 19th century, but she is also known for making a lot of racially insensitive remarks throughout her day, and she was known for saying that she did not support the black vote unless women also received the vote. So she was not okay with black men getting the vote if women did not receive it as well. And another thing that I'd like to mention just to kind of frame this presentation is that I think a lot of people, when they think about the women's suffrage movement, they kind of see it as this ultimate end goal, as if the suffragists just wanted the right to vote and that was that. But this was definitely not the case. I mean, the suffragists were smart, they had larger political aspirations beyond simply voting. And I think this quote by the historian Ellen Carroll Dubois really hits the nail on the head, and she says, suffragists were never really single issue people. They understood that getting the right to vote was the crucial tool for every important political change in American society, and they had a long list of changes they wanted to be part of. So let's fast forward about 50 years. A new century begins, the Civil War happens, the Confederates lose, slavery is abolished nationwide, the vote is extended to African American men, and we see the first formation of labor unions coincide with the rise of urban manufacturing. And while all this is happening, women are still fighting to gain the right to vote. And so we've got two separate but complementary women's led organizations that form around the same time. And these are the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was founded in 1900, and then the Women's Trade Union League, which was founded in 1903. So, while the International Ladies Garment Workers Union advocated on behalf of workers specifically working in women's garment factories, the Women's Trade Union League was much broader in their mission. They were, in fact, an organization that had both working class women as well as more wealthier, well off women as members, and they existed to support women in establishing labor unions in all different types of fields and in eliminating sweatshop conditions as a whole, not just in garment factories, but in all types of working conditions. But these two organizations often overlapped. So here's a picture of the Women's Trade Union League. So one such example is during what is called the Uprising of 20,000, and that was when women garment workers walked out of the job to protest labor conditions in New York. And it started off with just 20% of the workforce, but eventually 20,000 out of a total of 32,000 workers, so basically 2/3 of the workforce, joined the strikes. And these strikes lasted for 14 weeks. And wealthy women heard about the strikes and lent their support, sometimes marching with the garment workers in what was called the Mink Brigade, which is a term that the media used to kind of mock these upper class women, being like, oh, look at them with their little pet cause and marking with those lower class women. How silly are they? But they didn't realize that these women would eventually become a pretty significant political force. And this is a screenshot from a New York Times article from detailing those protests in 1909. And there's a quote that I know that I've read to you guys before, but I don't know why. I just love it so much. And they say the factory girl makes the shirtwaists and the college girl wears them. And when they walked Broadway arm in arm as pickets in the big shirtwaist strike that is now on, they both wore the garment of contention. So just, I thought it was a really nice way to paint the solidarity between the women of two classes fighting for the same cause. And these strikes and these demands for better labor conditions really came to a head in 1911. And a lot of you who, work in fair trade or have maybe went to NYU or have been in New York for a while, you know about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that happened in 1911 and killed 146 workers, mostly women and girls. Some of them were burned, couldn't get out of the factory, and others ended up jumping out the window and not surviving the fall. And it was after the fire that two significant things happened. So the first is that membership for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union grew significantly, as did the general public support for the labor movement. But it also went both ways. So not only did upper class women lend support to these working class strikers, but they actually used the event of the fire to recruit working class women, many of whom were also immigrant women, I should add, to the suffrage movement. And it was the Women's Trade Union League that played a large role in bridging this gap. And their big argument was essentially that if these working class women wanted to prevent another such tragedy from happening again, they would need a voice in electoral politics. So, what was originally a more upper class, privileged women's issue, the issue of women's suffrage, now became a mainstream issue for women of all backgrounds. And one of the women who spanned both of these worlds was Rose Schneiderman. She was an immigrant from Poland, and she started out as a factory worker, but then she eventually turned into a leading labor rights leader, and she's well known among people who study labor movements in the United States. And she was a leading member of the Women's Trade Union League, and she also participated herself in the uprising of the 20,000 that had happened a couple years prior. And she fervently believed that the political enfranchisement of women was an absolute necessity to improve their poor working conditions. And she's also known for coining the phrase bread and roses, which is from a line in her 1912 speech in support of women's suffrage. So I will read that line for you here. And she says, "What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist, the right to life as the rich woman has the right to life, and the sun, and music, and art. You have nothing that the humblest worker has not a right to have also. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses, too. Help, you women of privilege, give her the ballot to fight with." I think this is something we also talk a lot about today, that, whether we're working with workers in the United States or overseas, it's not just about a living wage enough to just simply survive, but people, regardless of what their job is, they should also have the right to thrive and enjoy life, not just simply, enough to get by day. All right, so this coalition of women continued to protest and they continued to stage public demonstrations. And basically, their tactic was to keep women's suffrage at the forefront of the public's mind. And that eventually leads to the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, guaranteeing women the right to vote. And I put an asterisk here because, as many of us are already aware, while the amendment guaranteed the right to vote to women in writing, it was not so in practice. For example, Native American women weren't recognized as American citizens until later on in the decade, and a lot of African American women were still denied the right to vote through other voter suppression tactics such as literacy tests, poll taxes, things like that. But it was still considered a pretty significant win for the women's suffrage movement. And well, I guess the big question is, okay, so did women winning the right to vote help the labor movement? And I would say yes, absolutely, but it also took some time. So I think some of you already know who the woman is on the right if you've heard some of my previous presentations on that. And that's Frances Perkins. And she was the Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt. And a few interesting notes about Frances Perkins is that she was having tea with friends in Washington Square Park when she witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And she was also a friend of Rose Schneiderman's. And it was actually Frances herself who said that the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was what she would say the day that the New Deal was born. And so she became involved with politics at the local level, passing new reforms for laborers across the state of New York. And then when FDR was elected president, he appointed her as his Secretary of Labor. And she was actually the first woman to hold a cabinet level position in any US administration. And she basically said, okay, yeah, I'll do it, but only if you pass these reforms. And that was actually easy because it turned out that FDR and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt were actually huge fans of the Women's Trade Union League. So they were very much in support of the demands that these labor unions had. So here we have an example of these women's political wishes being reflected and then implemented by their elected officials. And it's a win that still benefits us today because the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act is what brought us the minimum wage, 40-hour work week, overtime pay, etc. And it continues to be amended even to this day to keep up with current times, although, as we'll talk about later, probably not enough. But there have been about 12 amendments added to this act since it was originally passed in 1938. So the labor movement continued to play a vital role in supporting other key legislative victories outside of labor issues, and the two key ones in the prior century include the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which passed in 1964, and then, of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is finally when every American citizen, regardless of color or gender, was truly given the right to exercise the vote. So, what's next? How does the labor movement continue to play a role in electoral politics today? Well, I'm going to borrow from one of Hillary Clinton's famous quotes and edit it slightly. I would argue that women's issues are labor issues, and labor issues are women's issues once and for all. And this is especially key in the next round of labor activism because women make up the majority of minimum wage and service workers, not only in the US, but in other countries. And they also make up the majority of caretakers and domestic workers, which in a lot of cases is still a form of unpaid labor. So, as far as issues that are still being debated at the legislative level, we've got things like paid maternity leave. I'm sure many of you already know this, but the US is one of only, I think, two, possibly three countries on earth that doesn't have some form of mandated paid parental leave for new moms. And that has many economic repercussions outside of just those few months beyond after giving birth. We've got, for example, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is working to enact policy changes for the rights of these workers, who will become increasingly more important as the US population continues to age. And again, most of these are women workers. And then we've got other general issues like increasing the minimum wage, the Fight for 15, the Me Too movement, things like that. And I have here on the example, this photo on the right is from a protest strike, actually, staged by Unite Here, which is what the International Ladies Garment Workers Union eventually became in the 1990s. And it was workers at Marriott hotels who were striking and protesting for job security, about their workload, wages, and benefits. And their big slogan here was that one job should be enough. If you work 40 hours a week, you should make enough money to not only make ends meet, but also to be able to enjoy your life. Again, back to the whole bread and roses concept. You should not be working 40 hours a week and then also have to work another job on top of that. And they were actually successful in this strike. And I think it was workers across the country in San Francisco, Boston, San Diego, who ended up negotiating new contracts with Marriott hotels as a result of these strikes. And what about beyond the ballot box? So, in the past few decades, but especially I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, we see a new movement of people choosing to vote with their wallets. And that's a lot of what we talk about at the Fair Trade Coalition and in this movement is realizing, there's power in the halls of Congress, but there's also power in our everyday purchases. And we can decide what kind of world we want to live in by where we choose to spend our money. We can choose to support businesses that pay their workers well. We can choose to support businesses that care about the environment. We can choose to do these things with our wallet. And I think that not just people in the fair trade movement, but I think it's becoming a lot more mainstream and people realize, maybe once a year you go to the ballot and vote, but every day you can vote with your wallet. And I just like to circle back to this notion, linking the women's suffrage movement to everything else, with a final quote by historian Susan Ware. And she says, "The suffrage movement is not this finite, discrete thing. It's part of a much broader story about women's roles in American society. This isn't about one issue from 100 years in the past that a bunch of women in long dresses and big hats cared about. These are issues we're still fighting for today. And getting the vote was an absolutely necessary step in everything that came afterward." Pardon me for butchering that last line, but I think you guys could read it with me. And for those of you who are not already connected with me, or if this is your first NYC Fair Trade meeting, I encourage you to follow the Fair Trade Coalition on Instagram and to check out our website about becoming a member. And if you want to stay in touch with me, this is my Instagram at Michaela's Musings. And if you have any questions about the UN Global Compact, I'm at Rehnquist at unglobalcompact.org. And that is it from me. And thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys found it interesting.
Bravo, bravo. If I were giving critique, I'd say clear, clean, concise, to the point. So wonderful. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any questions, or what else? Maybe some key takeaways, what they found interesting. If anybody wants to unmute and share.
I have a question for just a general question. So thank you so much. Also, thank you, everyone. Give Michaela a round of applause. That's awesome. Thank you for taking your time. What I find fascinating is that as we learn and relearn together about these important leaders within the abolition movement and also the suffrage movement, is that we also have a lot of people within the left or the right that are very centrist. And I can see that this topic is coming up a lot from celebrities to, every day is like, let's reach across the aisle. So I was just wondering if all of you within the NYC FTC and then on the leadership team can think of a way that you can continue to create a conversation about fair trade and voting with your neighbors, other than just voting at the ballots, and what that might look like, whichever direction it goes in, for your day-to-day lives. And so that's just my general question. Like, does anyone have any comments that leaders that you follow, that you disagree with or agree with, that we could create these conversations with? That's it.
I love that question, and it makes me think, what will the holiday bring in terms of meeting with family? I think a lot of people who are working remotely, may go back home if home is far away and stay for a longer period of time. And, how I almost feel, taking your question, Liam, putting in the direction of self-care, how are we going to feel if the election doesn't go in our favor? And how are we going to handle, the rest of 2020? Maybe 2021 we'll be able to breathe and continue, but yeah, I think we have to prepare ourselves for either way. And I know for myself, I'm trying not to, I don't want to be surprised, right? Like I'm trying to mentally say it could go this way, it could go that way, but I'm going to be okay. So I don't know if anybody's kind of given thought to, what's going to happen after. Anybody, thoughts, feelings, opinions?
Yeah. Well, I guess I honestly haven't been thinking about what's going to happen if the election doesn't go in the way that I would like it to, because I almost don't even want to imagine that scenario, but I know that's not a smart way to look at things. But I like your idea about self-care. I think that's definitely, regardless of how it goes, I think we're all going to need to detox from these last few months. But in response to something that Lee said in terms of, how do we talk to people about fair trade? I mean, I know A lot of people I know don't necessarily support brands because of the fair trade principles, but they might choose to support certain brands or not support certain brands based off of their kind of political leanings, or if a certain brand has been very clear about supporting a candidate that they think that they fundamentally don't agree with, or they know that a company or the CEO of a company has donated a lot of money to elected officials who are passing policies that they think are quite detrimental, that then they might boycott. So yeah, I think that it can be about fair trade, but it can also be about, who you want to support in office or who you think should be in office making those decisions on behalf of the American people and also, the world at large, because what happens in this country does have ripple effects across the globe, whether we like it or not. So that's something that I think about a lot.
That's a really interesting point. I was speaking to my students and kind of highlighting how transformative this year has been, not only because of COVID, but because of because of Black Lives Matter, honestly, because so many companies overnight came out in support. And really before that, companies were not lending a voice, not only to Black Lives Matter, but to a variety of other causes, right? They would kind of keep their values and put them aside and not have that be out in display. So I think this holiday season, that trend is going to kind of continue, and we're going to see brands more and more using cause marketing, really. And I think it's our job as advocates to call out not just the greenwashing, but I love the new term, the woke washing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like companies that were using Black Lives Matter or other, campaigns and other causes like that to, gain more followers. But what have they really done since then to, prove that they really stand behind this and it's just not all lip service? So I think it will be interesting. I'm sure the normal listicles of Black-owned businesses you can support will come out, and we'll have, fair trade options, but it will be interesting to see what general marketing kind of comes out.
I'm going to chime in one more time. I believe Holly is on the call. Holly is the new fellow for Fair Trade USA, and she's going to be joining us next week and in the future, and chiming in and about what's happening for Fair Trade USA and the Towns campaign, and how the mesh of the new goals, or what are the new goals for the Towns campaign now that there's not a lot of retail, especially in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
So Holly, do you want to say hi? Do you want to unmute yourself and say hello to everyone?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm actually driving right now and talking or listening to like a podcast. But yeah, I'm your new fellow, and that's really exciting. And it's really great to hear all of your ambitious endeavors. It's really rewarding for me to hear a campaign that's really taking initiative on this stuff and kind of intersecting it with other movements. And that really inspires me a lot. But I know through COVID, there's a lot of campaigns and just activists who are feeling a little down right now. So I think kind of continuing on the education aspect is really, really great. And also, yeah, the goals do reflect having more focus on virtual events and different things like that, even just committee meetings. So even this obviously is an event, and it's great to see. And hopefully if you have any questions, you can reach out to me and I will try to help.
Thank you. And Holly, this is Andrea, but if there are any other campaigns out there who are wanting to partner with us, or who are wanting, to have a little burst of enthusiasm, feel free to connect them with us. Because I think, our goal with, leading for Manhattan's campaign is to, try and mentor other campaigns, or be the force that brings them all together. So if there's any way we can kind of help in that, we are more than happy to do that. So Michaela, one thing that I want to talk about, if it's okay with you guys to kind of go in this direction with the conversation of what is your plan for voting? And I kind of wanted to share with you guys what my plan is and how I've already messed up my plan today, and how I'm going to fix it.
Great.
Okay. So I have my mail-in ballot here, and I filled it out and I put it in the envelope and I signed it. But then I heard on the radio today that the Working Families Party needs 130,000 New Yorkers to vote for Biden on its line, meaning that when you fill out who you vote for, there's the Democratic, there is the Republican, and then there's another column, the Working Families Party, and then I believe another column as well. I don't have my ballot, I can't open it, it's sealed. So I, of course, did it under Democratic, but now I feel I would like to put it under the Working Families Party. So my original plan was to go to vote in person because we have early voting. So it actually starts this Saturday, right? The 24th is this Saturday.
Yeah.
So I was gonna go in person, and if the lines were insane or it just, you know, didn't work out for some reason, I was gonna have my mail-in ballot. So now I'm still gonna do that. I'm gonna wake up early Saturday, the first day, which may be dumb of me. I may have to go back on Tuesday, which I can do, as you know, someone who has a flexible schedule. But I think it's worth it for me to make that extra effort. And then for some reason, if it doesn't work out, then I will send in this ballot here. So I would plan that for you guys. And if anybody wants to share their plan, whether they're going to try to go early and not wait till November 3rd, I think that would be great. But does anybody have any questions about voting, or is anybody unsure of how to find some resources, or anybody want to share their plan?
This is my voting card because I had 3 people in my neighborhood get the wrong absentee ballot. So this is my voting card. I have vowed to myself to vote hell or high water, walk over, crush glass in person. And I'm taking my 75-year-old neighbor with me on Tuesday,
Oh, nice.
voting early.
Love that.
Anybody else want to share?
I will be voting early on Halloween, and going with my roommates. We're all registered in the same place, of course. And then I'm going to dress up in a costume and go to Prospect Park and try to do like an outdoor Halloween celebration to celebrate having voted. So that's my plan.
Anybody else want to share their plan?
I have a bit of a plan. So I'm kind of playing the system a little. I currently live in Burlington, Vermont, but I'm originally from Wisconsin. And just because it's a swing state, I'm keeping my voter registration there for now. And so I have an absentee ballot that I'll be mailing out today or tomorrow.
Awesome. Carolina, you wanted to add?
I was just gonna land from the airport and go straight to the ballots. That's it.
Where are you right now?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So I made it a point to make sure I fly in a few days before November 3rd and just go straight there.
Yeah.
And pre-tested COVID, obviously, before I get on the airplane.
Yeah.
So it was like,
Yeah.
you know.
Awesome.
Andrea, I actually had a question for you because I was also looking at voting on the Working Families line versus the Democratic line, and I haven't really done any research on it, which I know I should do before doing that. But from what you've read, what would you say is the key difference, or maybe the 2 or 3 key differences between the Working Families Party and the Democratic Party in terms of the platform and what they stand for?
So you got me. Since I heard about it today about them, and the New York Times came out with this article, I think I need to do a bit more research, but I do believe that having multiple parties is good in general, right? Not relying on a 2-party system. So even if there are things, right, Working Families, you know, from the onset, I'm like, is this marketing to me? Maybe not so much, but I think once I read a little bit more, but at least I think they deserve to be on the ballot and to remain in New York.